Isaac Reynolds never wanted to be here. He stared at the cheaply printed name tag stuck to his sweater. The words, "Hello, my name is Isaac," practically mocking him. The bright cafe around him buzzed with conversation, the scent of coffee and pastries thick in the air. A dozen small, round tables were spread across the room, each occupied by two strangers forced into 5-minute conversations before a bell rang and they had to move on. It was ridiculous. It was awkward. And he was only here because his best friend, Noah, had dared him. "If you don't go, you owe me $500. Noah had laughed, shoving the sign-up sheet into Isaac's hands. "Come on, man. Maybe you'll meet someone who makes you forget how much you hate dating." Isaac had rolled his eyes, but now here he was, regretting every life decision that had led him to this moment. The bell rang. His first date sat down a woman named Claire who talked nonstop about her cat. He nodded along, offering polite smiles until the bell rang again. Next was a woman who immediately asked about his salary. Then someone who confessed she was only here to get back at her ex. Then a girl who spent the entire time scrolling through her phone. It was a disaster. And then she sat down. Elizabeth Carter. She was different. Not in the forced "I'm unique" kind of way, but in a way that made Isaac sit up a little straighter, something in his chest tightening. Her dark brown hair was pulled into a loose ponytail, a few strands falling around her face. She had warm hazel eyes and a skeptical expression, like she wasn't impressed with this whole thing either. "You look like you're in pain," she said, smirking as she folded her arms on the table. Isaac let out a breath, running a hand through his hair. "That obvious?" "Painfully," he chuckled. "Let me guess. You're here on a dare to?" Elizabeth tilted her head, considering. "Not exactly. My best friend said I need to put myself out there." She made her quotes. "So here I am, speed dating with a bunch of strangers in a coffee shop." Isaac exhaled, leaning back. "Well, at least we're both suffering together." She laughed, a real laugh, not the polite kind. It was warm, genuine. "So, Isaac," she said, tapping her fingers against the table. "What's your tragic backstory? Why did your friend think you needed to be here?" He hesitated. He wasn't the kind of guy who spilled his life story to strangers. But something about Elizabeth made him feel safe. "I got out of a long relationship a year ago," he admitted. "Haven't really dated since." Her teasing expression softened. "Rough breakup?" He nodded. "Let's just say I trusted the wrong person." Elizabeth didn't pry, didn't ask for details. She just nodded like she understood. "What about you?" he asked. She sighed, glancing down at her hands. "I was engaged." Isaac blinked. "Was?" She nodded. "Turns out, my ex had a whole secret life I didn't know about. Found out 6 weeks before the wedding." Something sharp twisted in his chest. He didn't know why he suddenly wanted to find this guy and punch him, but the feeling was there. "I'm sorry," he said. Elizabeth waved a hand. "It's been 2 years. I'm fine. Mostly." They were quiet for a moment, the noise of the cafe filling the space between them. Then she grinned. "All right, enough tragic backstories. Let's make this fun." Isaac arched a brow. "Fun? Yeah. If we have to be here, we might as well enjoy it." She leaned forward. "Rapid-fire questions. First thing that comes to mind. Ready?" He smirked. "Go for it." "Favorite movie?" "Anything but rom-coms." She gasped, hand over her heart. "Tragic. I love rom-coms." Isaac chuckled. "All right, fine. I'll suffer through one if you pick a good one." Elizabeth's eyes sparkled. "Deal." "Next question, biggest fear?" Isaac hesitated, then said, "Wasting time on the wrong person again." She blinked, caught off guard. But then she nodded. "Yeah. Same." The bell rang. Their time was up. For the first time all night, Isaac didn't want to move to the next table. Elizabeth stood, offering him a small smile. "Well, Isaac, it was nice meeting you." He should have let her walk away. Should have just accepted that this was how speed dating worked. But he didn't. "Wait," he said, standing quickly. She turned back, eyebrows raised. He cleared his throat, suddenly feeling like an idiot. "Do you want to get coffee?" "Like real coffee. Not this forced, awkward thing." Elizabeth studied him for a second. Then slowly she smiled. "I'd like that." Isaac felt something shift in his chest, something unfamiliar. For the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. Isaac wasn't nervous. At least, that's what he kept telling himself as he stepped into the quiet, tucked-away cafe where he and Elizabeth had agreed to meet. It was different from the speed-dating venue, smaller, warmer, intimate in a way that made his pulse quicken just slightly. He spotted her instantly. She was seated by the window, absent-mindedly stirring a cup of something that sent wisps of steam curling into the air. The golden glow of the late afternoon sun hit her face just right, accentuating the soft curve of her cheekbone. She looked up, her hazel eyes lighting up as she saw him. "You actually showed," she teased, setting her spoon down. Isaac pulled out the chair across from her. "I figured I'd suffer through at least one rom-com conversation for you." Elizabeth gave him an exaggerated look of relief. "Finally, some progress. You're learning." The easy banter was still there, but this time, there was something else hanging between them. Unspoken, undefined. He ordered coffee, and for a few moments they just sat in comfortable silence. The sounds of the cafe clinking cups, low murmurs of conversation, the occasional hiss of the espresso machine settled around them. "So," Elizabeth finally said, tilting her head slightly, "what made you say yes to speed dating? I mean, you don't really seem like the type." Isaac let out a breath, leaning back in his chair. "I lost a bet." Her lips twitched. "That explains a lot." "What about you?" he asked, genuinely curious. She traced the rim of her cup with her finger before answering. I just wanted to prove to myself that I could do it." He frowned. "Do what?" "Put myself out there again," she admitted, her voice quieter now. "After everything with my ex, I kind of swore off dating for a while. But then my friend convinced me that maybe it was time to at least try." Isaac studied her. There was something raw in her voice, something she wasn't saying outright. "Was it hard?" he asked. Elizabeth let out a soft laugh, though there wasn't much humor in it. "Terrifying." He nodded in understanding. "Yeah, I get that." They didn't need to say more. There was an unspoken acknowledgement between them, a recognition of shared wounds even if the details were different. Then, as if sensing the heaviness of the moment, Elizabeth straightened and gave him a pointed look. "All right, we need a topic change before this turns into a therapy session." Isaac chuckled. "Agreed." She tapped her fingers against the table. "Tell me something unexpected about you." He considered for a moment before saying, "I built a treehouse when I was 12. Still standing." Her brows lifted. "Impressive. What's inside it?" "A couple of old comic books, a flashlight that probably doesn't work anymore, and a carved message from my best friend declaring that we ruled the world." Elizabeth grinned. "I kind of love that." He shrugged. "What about you?" She exhaled, thinking. "I once got lost in Paris for an entire day." Isaac blinked. "How?" "I had a terrible sense of direction and my phone died. I wandered for hours before I finally found my hotel again." She shook her head. "I had to rely entirely on my horrible French and a very kind old woman who took pity on me." Isaac laughed. "That sounds like something out of a movie." She shot him a knowing look. "A rom-com, maybe?" He groaned. "I walked right into that one." Elizabeth laughed, her eyes crinkling at the corners, and something warm settled in Isaac's chest. They talked for hours. About childhood memories, odd habits, the best and worst meals they'd ever had. The conversation flowed effortlessly, like they'd known each other for longer than just a few days. Eventually, the cafe started to empty out, the sky outside deepening into rich shades of indigo. Isaac glanced at his watch and sighed. "I should probably let you go." Elizabeth's expression flickered, like she wasn't entirely ready for the evening to end either. She hesitated, then said, "Do you want to walk for a bit?" He didn't even need to think about it. Yeah, I'd like that." They left the cafe and stepped onto the quiet street, a cool breeze curling around them. As they walked, their hands brushed once, then twice. The third time, Isaac didn't pull away, and neither did she. Isaac hadn't been able to stop thinking about Elizabeth. It had been 3 days since their coffee date, 3 days since their walk through the cool night air, 3 days since he'd felt the accidental brush of her fingers against his and fought the urge to intertwine them completely. He wasn't the kind of man who got easily distracted, but Elizabeth had settled into his thoughts like a melody he couldn't shake. So when he finally worked up the nerve to call her and ask if she wanted to meet again, and she said yes without hesitation, something inside him lifted. Now, standing outside a small bookstore she had chosen, he found himself feeling something dangerously close to nervousness. He spotted her before she saw him. She was tucked between the shelves, her eyes scanning the spines of books with the kind of quiet concentration that made the world around her disappear. The dim lighting cast soft shadows along her profile, and for a moment he simply watched her, taking in the way she absent-mindedly tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Then, as if sensing him, she turned. A slow smile touched her lips. "You're early," he exhaled, stepping closer. "So are you." They stood there for a beat, the air between them charged with something unspoken. Elizabeth tilted her head toward the shelves. "I used to come here all the time," she said. "There's something about used bookstores. Feels more personal." Isaac glanced at the rows of books, their worn covers and yellowed pages carrying stories beyond the ones printed inside. "Do you have a favorite?" She reached for a novel and held it out to him. "This one." He took it from her, studying the title. "Why this one?" Elizabeth leaned against the shelf, crossing her arms. "I read it when I was 19. It was the first book that made me cry." Isaac arched a brow. "That's the selling point?" She laughed, shaking her head. "No, it just stuck with me. You ever experience something at just the right time in your life, and it buries itself into who you are?" His chest tightened. He knew exactly what she meant. "Yeah," he said. "I get that." She studied him for a second, then nudged his arm. "All right, your turn. What's something that stuck with you?" Isaac exhaled, thinking. "There's a song," he admitted. "From when I was a kid. My dad used to play it in the car. Every time I hear it, even now, it takes me back to those drives." Elizabeth's expression softened. "That's a good one." They wandered through the aisles, conversation flowing easily. She told him about the time she tried to bake a cake and nearly set her oven on fire. He told her about the road trip he took with his best friend in college, the kind of reckless adventure they barely survived but never regretted. Eventually, they found themselves in the back of the store where an old piano sat against the wall, its keys slightly worn from years of use. Elizabeth ran her fingers across them lightly. "Do you play?" Isaac hesitated, then pressed a single note. "Used to." Her eyes flickered with curiosity. "Why'd you stop?" He let out a slow breath. "Life got in the way." Elizabeth didn't push, didn't ask for more than he was willing to give. Instead, she tapped one of the keys, the soft note lingering in the quiet space between them. "I think you should play again," she said simply. Something in her voice made his chest tighten. The store began to dim as the evening stretched on, and when they finally stepped outside, the city lights had taken over the sky. They walked side by side, the streets quieter now, the air crisp. Elizabeth glanced at him. "So, what now?" Isaac met her gaze, the answer coming easily. "Dinner." She grinned. "Good. I'm starving." They found a small diner down the block, the kind with checkered floors and vinyl booths that had been worn down over time. The moment they sat down, Elizabeth picked up the menu with exaggerated seriousness. "All right, most important question of the night. Pancakes or waffles?" Isaac didn't hesitate. "Pancakes." Elizabeth gasped, clutching her chest in mock betrayal. "Wrong answer." He chuckled, shaking his head. "You're one of those waffle people, huh?" She nodded firmly. "Absolutely." They placed their orders, and as they waited, their conversation deepened. Elizabeth rested her arms on the table, her expression turning thoughtful. "Do you ever think about how much one moment can change everything?" Isaac tilted his head. "What do you mean?" She traced the rim of her glass. "Like, what if I had skipped speed dating that night? What if I decided it wasn't worth it?" His throat tightened. He didn't want to think about that. "Then I never would have met you," he admitted. Elizabeth's hazel eyes met his, something unreadable passing between them. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Then softly, she smiled. "I'm glad I went." Something inside Isaac shifted, and for the first time in a long time, he realized how terrifying it was to want something this much. Isaac wasn't sure when it happened. Maybe it had been that first night at the cafe, when Elizabeth had looked at him with understanding instead of pity. Maybe it was when they walked through the city, their hands brushing just enough to make his pulse stutter. Or maybe it was in the bookstore when she told him he should play piano again, her voice so certain that for the first time in years, he actually considered it. But at some point between then and now, he had started falling for her. And that terrified him. He had known her for such a short time, and yet, she occupied every quiet moment in his mind. The way her eyes lit up when she talked about something she loved, the way she challenged him, called him out without hesitation, made him laugh when he least expected it. He had been careful for so long. He had kept his heart guarded, unwilling to risk another mistake, another betrayal. And yet, with Elizabeth, the walls he had so carefully built were crumbling faster than he could stop them. So when she invited him to an art exhibit, he said yes without hesitation. The gallery was nestled in a quiet part of the city, its walls lined with paintings that ranged from abstract bursts of color to hauntingly detailed portraits. Soft classical music played overhead, the kind that made everything feel a little more dramatic than it already was. Elizabeth walked ahead of him, pausing every so often to study a piece. Isaac wasn't sure what he was supposed to be looking for, but he found himself more interested in watching her than the art itself. She glanced back at him. "You hate this, don't you?" He huffed a quiet laugh. "I wouldn't say hate." She folded her arms. "Dislike, then?" He shrugged. "Just trying to figure out what I'm supposed to be seeing." Elizabeth turned back to a large abstract painting, her expression contemplative. "You don't have to see anything specific. Just feel it." Isaac raised a brow. "Feel it?" She nodded. "Art isn't always meant to be understood. Sometimes it's just meant to make you feel something." He looked at the painting again. It was a mess of deep reds and blues, bold and chaotic, like the artist had poured every emotion they had onto the canvas without restraint. And when he really let himself look, he did feel something. Elizabeth must have seen something shift in his expression because she smiled. "See? You're a natural." He shook his head, amused, but didn't argue. They wandered through the exhibit, stopping at different pieces, sharing thoughts and impressions. At one point, she paused in front of a portrait of a woman staring out a window, her expression unreadable. Elizabeth studied it for a long time before speaking. "She looks like she's waiting for something." Isaac tilted his head. "Or someone." Elizabeth's lips pressed together as if the thought struck something deeper. He hesitated, then asked, "Were you waiting?" She turned to him, her brows drawing together. "For what?" He swallowed, choosing his words carefully. "After your engagement ended, were you waiting for something to change before you let yourself move on?" Elizabeth let out a slow breath, her gaze drifting back to the painting. "I think I was waiting to feel like myself again. To not feel like I had failed at something that was supposed to last forever." Isaac's chest tightened. He understood that more than he wanted to admit. "You didn't fail," he said. She let out a quiet laugh, but it was laced with something bitter. "Didn't I?" "No," his voice was firm. "You trusted someone. You loved them. That's not failure." Elizabeth turned to him then, something unguarded in her expression. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, gently, she said, "What about you?" Isaac exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I think I was waiting to stop being angry." Elizabeth didn't push. She just nodded like she understood exactly what he meant. They left the gallery, stepping into the cool night air. Isaac didn't want the evening to end. "Are you hungry?" he asked, glancing at her. A soft smile touched her lips. "Always." They found a small food stand on the corner, the kind that sold warm, greasy comfort food that tasted better than any fancy restaurant. They ate on a bench, the city buzzing around them, laughter and conversation spilling from nearby streets. Elizabeth took a bite of her food and sighed dramatically. "This might be the best thing I've ever eaten." Isaac chuckled. "That good?" She nodded. "I judge all experiences by the quality of food involved. This is top tier." He grinned, watching her. And then, before he could stop himself, he said, "This is the best night I've had in a long time." Elizabeth looked at him, her expression softening. And just like that, the air between them changed. Her gaze flickered to his lips for the briefest second before she quickly looked away. Isaac's pulse pounded. He wanted to kiss her. The realization hit him so hard it nearly knocked the breath from his lungs. He wanted to kiss her, to pull her close, to know what she tasted like, to feel the way she would melt into him. But he didn't, because if he kissed her, there would be no turning back. And he wasn't sure if they were ready for that yet. Instead, he reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. Elizabeth inhaled sharply but didn't pull away. They sat there for a long time, the weight of something unspoken settling between them. And Isaac knew then, without a doubt, that he was already in too deep. Isaac had never been the type to believe in fate. He believed in choices, in actions, in cause and effect. But as he sat across from Elizabeth in a quiet corner of a dimly lit jazz lounge, listening to the smooth hum of a saxophone fill the air, He couldn't help but wonder if something beyond logic had led him here, to her. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of late-night conversations, spontaneous adventures, and stolen moments that left him breathless. It was terrifying how natural it felt being with her. How easily she had slipped into his life, filling spaces he hadn't even realized were empty. Elizabeth was watching the band, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass absent-mindedly. She looked serene, lost in the music, but Isaac could sense something beneath the surface. A quiet tension in the way she held herself, a slight furrow in her brow that hadn't been there before. He leaned in, resting his forearms on the table. "You're thinking about something." She blinked as if pulled from a distant thought and gave a small shrug. "Just wondering how we got here." Isaac tilted his head. "Here's in tonight? Or here's in?" He let the question hang between them. Elizabeth hesitated, then exhaled slowly. "Both, I guess." The music swelled, filling the space between them, but Isaac barely noticed. "I could ask you the same thing," he said, watching her carefully. "How did we get here?" She glanced at him, something unreadable in her expression. "I think it started with bad coffee and a terrible speed dating event." Isaac chuckled. "Worst decision I've ever made. And somehow the best." Elizabeth's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something, but instead, she reached for her drink. It was subtle, but Isaac knew deflection when he saw it. Before he could press further, the band finished their set, and the murmur of conversation grew louder around them. Elizabeth straightened slightly. "Do you ever think about what happens next?" Isaac leaned back in his chair, studying her. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then set her glass down. "This, where it's going." His heartbeat stuttered, but he kept his expression steady. "Do you want an answer? Or are you still figuring it out?" Elizabeth let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "I don't know. I didn't expect this." Isaac nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Neither of them had walked into that coffee shop looking for something real. And yet, here they were. He reached across the table, brushing his fingers against hers. "I don't have all the answers, Elizabeth. But I know I don't want this to be temporary." Her breath hitched slightly, and for a moment he thought she might pull away. But then, slowly, she turned her hand over, letting their palms press together. It was such a simple touch, yet it sent something electric through him. She met his gaze, her eyes searching his. "What if we get it wrong?" Isaac exhaled. "Then we figure it out. Together." Elizabeth's fingers curled slightly around his, and something in her expression softened. They didn't need grand declarations or promises they weren't ready to make. For now, this was enough. And for the first time in a long time, Isaac wasn't afraid of what came next. Isaac didn't know how love was supposed to happen. He had thought once that it was a slow build, something that took years of careful cultivation. But with Elizabeth, it was like a wildfire. Something that had sparked the moment she sat across from him that night at speed dating and hadn't stopped growing since. He had spent years guarding himself, keeping people at a distance, convinced that love was a risk not worth taking again. But Elizabeth made him rethink everything. And now, as they walked hand in hand through a quiet park, the autumn breeze crisp against their skin, he knew he didn't want to hold back anymore. Elizabeth swung their joined hands slightly, glancing up at him. "You're quiet." Isaac exhaled, gathering his thoughts. "Just thinking." She nudged his side playfully. "Dangerous habit." A chuckle rumbled in his chest, but his expression remained thoughtful. "Do you ever wonder how different things would be if we hadn't met that night?" Elizabeth tilted her head, considering. "I don't think I want to." He glanced at her, surprised by the certainty in her voice. She continued, her tone softer now. "It's like when you read a book, and you can't imagine the story going any other way. It just fits." Something in his chest tightened. He wasn't sure he'd ever heard anything described so perfectly. They reached a quiet bench near the edge of the park, the city skyline visible beyond the trees. The world around them was peaceful, the kind of stillness that made everything feel more real, more significant. Isaac turned toward her, his gaze steady. "Elizabeth." She met his eyes, something flickering in her expression, as if she already knew what he was about to say. I don't want to spend my life wondering what if, he said. I don't want to waste time being afraid of something that already feels inevitable. Her breath hitched slightly, her fingers tightening around his. Inevitable? He nodded, his voice unwavering. You. The weight of the words settled between them, heavier than anything they had said before. Elizabeth swallowed hard, blinking against the emotion in her eyes. Isaac. He reached for her other hand, holding both of them between his own. I know it's been fast. I know we didn't plan for this. But I also know I don't want a life without you in it. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she was smiling, her expression a mix of disbelief and overwhelming emotion. You're really all in, aren't you? Isaac let out a breath, shaking his head slightly. I think I was from the moment you sat down across from me. Elizabeth let out a soft, breathless laugh, as if the weight of everything they had built in such a short time had just fully settled on her. Then slowly she reached up, cupping his face between her hands. I love you, Isaac. His pulse pounded, not with fear, but with the sheer force of what she had just said. He didn't hesitate. I love you, too. And then she kissed him. It wasn't hesitant, wasn't careful. It was deep, consuming, filled with everything they hadn't said, with every moment they had spent falling without realizing they had already landed. When they finally pulled back, her forehead rested against his, their breaths mingling in the cool night air. Isaac pressed a soft kiss to the corner of her mouth, his voice barely above a whisper. This is real, isn't it? Elizabeth nodded, her smile wide and unguarded. Completely. And for the first time in years, Isaac felt like he had finally found something worth holding onto. He wasn't letting go. Not ever.